They say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. If that's what it is, then archetypes in Fire Emblem are the rhyming of this series. There are so many different archetypes to talk about, so many different to choose from, so many different ones that are fan favorites, so many that are made just because people want an excuse to be able to put something together. We have things like Jagans, Canaanables, Ogmas, Boards and Chords, Lenas, Navars, and then you start getting into ones that are more niche. Marias, Minervas. Oh, Minerva is pretty classic. Linde, White Wings. If there's any archetype that I want to explicitly just throw out the window, it's that Lorenz is the archetype. Because I feel that the difficult to recruit aspect of the Lorenz archetype is only true really from Sheena onwards, not really Lorenz. Anyway, Fire Emblem archetypes. Are they a hot button issue? Is this something that people already know? I don't know. But I wanted to talk a little bit about it just because I have no other ideas for an April Fool's Day video and I just wanted to have something to talk about. Um, Fire Emblem archetypes I find are very useful, but I also find are incredibly useless. I think that archetypes are fun. I think that archetypes allow for us to discuss things from a game design perspective, from a story design perspective. I think that archetypes are more useful for game designers and for mod creators than they are for players. I think that as players, they can become a useful shorthand, but I think a lot of them can become problematic when used when the archetype name is more confusing than just saying what it is. Like, Malladus? Why the heck is Malladus an archetype? Like, if Malladus is okay, it's the non-character, it's the NPC that gives, that is supposed to be either a tactician or advisor or something, sure, whatever. If we leave it as an NPC, then that's fine. But once we start getting actual playable characters here, it's like, okay, well, what's the point? Is just that this character comes up and talks about strategy stuff in story cutscenes? I mean, that's also kind of helpful to refer to, helpful to note, but I don't think that adding, like, Byleth here as a Malladus is accurate or helpful at all. You know? I think that we have definitely an oversaturation of care about archetypes in the Fire Emblem community, and this is obviously inspired by and taken from a mecha video that I just watched. So go watch that video if you want, a 20-plus minute take. I'm not going to try and stretch this 2-minute topic into 20 minutes, but we'll see. I feel like archetypes in Fire Emblem, I mean, obviously they're useful. Obviously they're useful because history rhymes, because the series rhymes, because we want things to kind of make sense, and we want to be able to compare and contrast. We want to be able to say, hey, the Navarre archetype, you have Navarre. He's a red unit. He's a sword fighter. He has a killing edge. He has some connection with a cleric, in this case Lena. He gets recruited by Sita. Who's the Navarre archetype in whatever X number of games? Some games don't have one. Some games have multiple. The most interesting potential discussion I find about Navarre is, who's more Navarre-like? Is it Ira or Jamka? That's it. And I don't necessarily think that's interesting in terms of a gameplay perspective, because ultimately it doesn't matter. They're both red units that you recruit that are dangerous in different ways. But if you're talking about from a game design perspective, hey, let's take this archetype and work it into something that's a little bit more interesting. Then you can say, hey, we have this idea of, hey, it's an enemy, they have a killer edge or some sort of killer weapon, they can crit you, they're really dangerous to fight, but we want you to be able to recruit them, but you need to be careful to recruit them or recruit them in a very specific way. That makes something like Ira, that makes something like Jamka. If you get too stuck up on the specifics of the archetype, though, more than just the broad strokes idea, then you get these pointless discussions of, oh, what was the one he referenced in his video? Is Erica a Malladus? And I'm just like, why do you care? No. Why do you care? And also, no. It's like, do we need Rudolph archetypes? Do we need Cliff archetypes? Do we need Harden archetypes? I don't know. I don't know what archetypes we need and what archetypes we don't. I know that archetypes are useful, archetypes are nice, archetypes are helpful, but when you look at archetype soup up here, what's the point? Archetypes are not the problem. Archetype soup is the problem. Like, I really love some of these classic archetypes. Jagan is a great gameplay archetype. Cain and Abel is a great gameplay archetype, not for having two units that are green and red, but for having two units of the same class that have certain small differences that are interesting to think about and talk about. Is one more defensive and one more offensive? Is one faster? Is one more bulky? Does one have better growths? Does one have better bases? I think, was it Bearwick Saga that did something weird like that? Ninjas. The ninjas of Fates. Saizo and Kaze. Saizo is slower, more powerful, also more magic based. Kaze is very fast, but has very low strength cap. They're interesting. They're different, but similar, and it's those differences with those similarities that make them interesting, and that's why Cain and Abel is an interesting gameplay archetype. Someone like an Ogma, that's more of a story archetype, not necessarily gameplay. Board and Cord. These units that just kind of come in, they're filler, they, again, kind of like Cain's and Abel's, they have their differences matter more than their similar. They're similar and they're different, and both their similarities and their differences matter, but their differences make them more interesting for their similarities. Julian, he's a thief. Next question. Next archetype. Lena, she's a healer. Next archetype. Navarre, again, interesting gameplay discussion because you're talking about recruitment, you're talking about killer weapons, you're talking about connections to other characters, you're talking about flagging their recruitability. You're talking about how you approach them to recruit them. That all is interesting gameplay-wise, narrative-wise, meta-wise, and can be useful from a game design perspective if you're like making your own fan hack. Hey, do I want a Navarre type unit here? How do I make that work? Merrick, less useful. He's a mage. Wendell, kind of less useful. He's maybe a pre-promoted sage, maybe he's not, I don't know. George, less useful. Maria, less useful. Minerva, one of the classic favorite archetypes. Wyvern Rider, usually red color scheme, usually female, turns traitor for idealistic reasons. Good archetype, solid, you know what's up. Linda, not as useful archetype. White Wings, useful archetype. Do you have groups of Pegasus Knights? Do they have a triangle attack? Useful flagging device, useful archetype. Est, debatably useful archetype, if it even really exists. I think this is an example of people wanting to create an archetype because of certain common threads in units, and wanting to string them together, but not really having enough string to do so, because the Est archetype is basically, at its core, a low-level unit that joins late into the game. A lot of units could qualify as Ests. Not all Ests have to have good growths, not all Ests have to be bad, not all Ests have to be good. Est is just a low-level unit that arrives late into the game, and that's the only real connecting thread. All of the other information, frankly, is misinformation about Ests because it doesn't hold true across the number of Ests. It's only true looking at specific units. Tiki may be a useful archetype to talk about, but I don't even know. I think that Tiki units are oftentimes not really... they don't really show up a lot. Samson and Aaron, a dead archetype, but an archetype that's very useful to talk about and very interesting gameplay-wise because it's a forced choice. One or the other. You can't have both. Because of Fire Emblem, modern Fire Emblem's obsession with people being able to perfect 100% the game, they're almost never going to have Aaron and Samsons unless it's either a remake or they do a very hard take on it. Lorenz, again, shouldn't be a Lorenz archetype, should be a Shima archetype. Goto, somewhat useful archetype, but more so in design, game design context than in necessarily talking about specific units, like breaking down. Still useful gameplay wise, still useful to say, hey, here's a late game unit, usually a sage, who's able to help carry you through the final maps, though might not be able to do it all himself. Perfect. Cornelius, okay, you have a dead dad. Malletus, okay, you have an NPC who talks to you. Michaelis, what even is this archetype? Draco Knights that are enemies, vain or ambitious, claim power for themselves. What? Okay, villain. Villain archetype for villainous reasons. Michaelis, Camus, Camus, Garneth, Gazak. Oh yes, the early game bandit is an archetype that we need to clarify. Camus is interesting because it's a character who you feel like should be recruitable but is not recruitable. That's what's interesting about Camus. Garneth, no. Gazak, no. They're the big bad, they're the little bad. Next question, next archetype. Harden, emperors that are twisted and turned. Why is Harden and Rudolph an archetype? And also Cliff is an archetype? Because Cliff is apparently the villager that we need to talk about who has, like, low level but is high growths or something? Or has good potential or something? It's like, why Cliff and not Gray or Tobin? Why just Cliff? Why is the archetype named after Cliff? I think the villager archetype is interesting. I think it's useful from both a gameplay and game design perspective, but I don't think we should be calling it Cliff. Rudolph. Again, why? Enemy emperor who I don't know and I don't care. Beowulf, sure, that's a useful-ish archetype because it's an enemy you have to pay gold to recruit, but why are we calling it after Beowulf, the one from the least played game in the series, Western-wise at least, not in Japan, but Japan never wants us to have FE4 legitimately, so yeah. Bandit twins, that's kind of a fun archetype. I agree with leaving that one as an archetype, but I think like the Gazak archetype, the Garnef archetype, it's like, no, no. Bandit twins are a more interesting archetype because they are more unique of a trope to Fire Emblem. That's what archetypes are. Archetypes are tropes. Plain and simple. They are tropes that happen to have some sort of gameplay value. Like it or leave it, that's what they are. What are your thoughts on archetypes? Also, happy April Fool's Day. I'm releasing this video on April 1st. This is a somewhat serious video, somewhat joking nature. I do honestly think archetypes are valuable, but I don't think archetypes should be the be-all, end-all. And I think that a lot of these archetypes need to be cut or at least renamed. That's my take on it. Let me know your takes in the comments down below. Till next time, this is Myth Rosanna signing out.